The morning Maria Underwood rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she had a wanted poster pinned directly to the front of her riding coat, bold as a declaration of war, and every soul on the main street stopped cold in their tracks just to stare. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of civilization like a man leaning too far over a cliff, one good wind from falling into chaos. The cattle drives came through like rivers of dust and noise, the saloons never fully closed, and the law walked a thin, fragile line between order and the wild country that breathed just outside of town. It was not a gentle place. It was not a place that tolerated weakness. But it was the place Maria Underwood had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of what she was doing, because the man who had ruined her life was somewhere inside it. She sat tall in the saddle on a chestnut mare named Copper, her dark hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, her jaw set like carved stone. She wore the wanted poster pinned to her chest with a single brass tack, smooth and precise, as though it had been done with great care. The poster was her own likeness, a rough woodcut print that barely captured her features, but the name underneath was printed perfectly clear: Maria Underwood. Wanted for the theft of $140 and the arson of the Hargrove dry goods store in Abilene, Kansas. Reward of $50. Every word on that poster was a lie. She rode Copper down the main street at a slow, deliberate walk, her eyes straight ahead, and she let every single person get a good long look. She wanted them to see her. She wanted them to know exactly who she was before she had to explain herself, because she had learned the hard way that a woman who waited for someone else to introduce her usually got introduced wrong. The crowd at the edge of the saloon went quiet. A group of cowboys loitering outside the feed store exchanged glances. A woman in a calico dress pressed her child behind her skirt, and from the window of the sheriff's office, a pair of steady gray eyes tracked Maria Underwood from the moment she turned the corner to the moment she pulled Copper to a halt directly in front of the office door. Sheriff Simon Prescott had been in Caldwell for 3 years. He was 31 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean in the hip, with a face that had been weathered by sun and worry into something that was not exactly handsome in a simple way, but deeply compelling in the way that faces are when every line on them means something. He wore his badge like he'd earned it, which he had, and he wore his Colt like a man who hoped never to have to use it, which was the mark of a good lawman. He had seen plenty of unusual things ride into Caldwell. He had never seen a woman ride in with her own wanted poster pinned to her chest. He came out of the office and stood on the wooden boardwalk, thumbs resting easy at his belt, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. Maria met his gaze and did not blink. "I know what that says," she told him before he could open his mouth. Her voice was clear and direct, slightly rough from too many miles of dusty trail. "Every word of it is false. I rode in like this because I figured you'd find out sooner or later, and I'd rather you hear my side before someone else fills your ear with nonsense." Simon looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the poster. He looked at her face. He looked at the exhaustion that lived behind her eyes like something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. He stepped down off the boardwalk and said, "Sit down and let me help." She blinked. That was not the response she had prepared herself for. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me," Simon said, his voice even and unhurried. "You didn't ride into the middle of town with that pinned to your chest because you're guilty. Guilty people don't announce themselves. You rode in that way because you're in some kind of trouble and you're trying to get ahead of it. So come inside, sit down, and tell me what's actually going on." Maria stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she swung down from Copper with the practiced ease of someone who had spent more time in a saddle than out of one, looped the reins over the post, and followed Simon Prescott through the door of the sheriff's office. The office was small and practical: a scarred wooden desk, 2 chairs, a rack of rifles locked behind iron bars, a pot-bellied stove that was cold in the summer heat, and a door leading back to two holding cells that were currently empty. Simon pulled the better of the two chairs around to face him and gestured for her to take it. Maria unpinned the wanted poster from her coat with deliberate fingers, set it flat on the desk between them, and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily. She was 26 years old, and she had the bearing of a woman who had learned to appear composed even when everything inside her was fighting to get out. "My name is Maria Underwood," she said. "I am originally from Missouri. I came to Abilene 2 years ago after my mother passed because I had a cousin there who offered me work in her dressmaking shop. The shop was on the same street as Hargrove's dry goods store. I had nothing to do with the fire that burned it down." Simon picked up the wanted poster, read it carefully, and set it back down. "Who's claiming you did?" "A man named Douglas Fitch," Maria said, and the name came out like something she'd bitten down on too hard. "He is, or was, a business associate of Calvin Hargrove. I had a dispute with Fitch. He was trying to force my cousin out of her shop so he could purchase the property cheap, and I went to the county judge to report it. 2 weeks after I filed that complaint, the dry goods store burned, and suddenly my name was on a poster." Simon leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment, and Maria found herself paying attention to his quiet. It was not the uncomfortable kind, not the dismissive kind. It was the kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking. "Why Caldwell?" he asked. "That's a far ride from Abilene." "Because Douglas Fitch is here," Maria said, "or he will be within the week. He has business dealings with a cattle buyer named Morrow who operates out of Caldwell. I followed his trail. I intend to make him confess, or at the very least to find evidence enough to clear my name." Simon looked at her again with those gray eyes that seemed to take the full measure of a person without being unkind about it. "You followed a man who framed you for arson, across 200 miles of Kansas, alone." "I did. That's either very brave or very reckless." "In my experience," Maria said, "those two things look identical from the outside." Something shifted in Simon's expression. Not quite a smile, it didn't reach that far, but a loosening around the eyes, a slight softening at the corners of his mouth that told her she had surprised him pleasantly. He stood up and moved to a wooden cabinet along the wall, poured 2 tin cups of water from a clay pitcher, and set one on the desk in front of her. "All right, Miss Underwood," he said, settling back into his chair. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." And so she did. She talked for the better part of an hour, and Simon Prescott listened the way she had almost stopped believing anyone would, completely, attentively, without interrupting her to correct or dismiss or minimize. She told him about Abilene, about her cousin Clara and the dressmaking shop called Needle and Thread, about Douglas Fitch arriving in town with money and a practiced smile, and an eye for acquiring properties at prices that were not quite offers so much as they were threats. She told him about the women on that street who had been pressured into selling, about Clara holding out because the shop had been their mother's dream and Clara had spent 12 years building it. She told him about going to the judge, about the 2 weeks of waiting and hoping, and then about the morning she woke to the smell of smoke and found the dry goods store a skeleton of charred timber, and Douglas Fitch standing in the street telling anyone who would listen that he had seen Maria Underwood leaving the scene. She told him about running. She was not proud of it, but she told him the truth. She had run because she was a woman alone with no money and no powerful friends, and a lie that had been built by a man who had both. And she knew what happened to women like her when they stood in front of a court, with nothing but their own word against a man like Douglas Fitch. When she finished, the silence in the office was different from before. It was heavier and it had a texture to it, the texture of injustice that had been recognized and named. Simon turned the tin cup in his hands and looked at the middle distance. "Fitch has been through Caldwell before," he said, half to himself. "I know the name. Never had cause to look at him too closely." He paused. "That changes now." Maria looked at him with a careful, measuring look. She had not fully decided yet whether to trust him. She had not fully decided whether she trusted anyone. "You believe me," she said, and it came out less like a statement and more like a question she had not entirely meant to ask aloud. Simon looked up and met her eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "I believe you." "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. I rode in here with a wanted poster on my chest. For all you know, that was a performance to get ahead of the law." "It could be," Simon agreed, easily and without defensiveness. "But guilty people don't usually have eyes like yours." Maria blinked. "I don't know what that means." "It means," Simon said, setting his cup down and leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, "that what I see in your face is not the guilt of a person trying to manage a story. It's the exhaustion of a person telling the truth for the first time to someone who might actually do something about it." He paused. "I've been a lawman for 9 years, Miss Underwood. I've learned to read the difference." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then something in her chest, something she had been holding together through sheer will and stubbornness and the refusal to let Douglas Fitch win, shifted very slightly, like a board under pressure that has found something solid to rest on at last. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than the word could fully carry. Simon stood up and picked his hat off the hook by the door. "I'm going to see about getting you a room at the boarding house down the street. Mrs. Henley runs it and she's a decent woman. I'll also see about getting your horse to the livery. You look like you haven't slept properly in days." "I haven't," Maria admitted. "Then sleep," he said. "I'll start making inquiries about Fitch." Quietly. "Don't go anywhere near Morrow's cattle operation until I tell you it's time. If Fitch hears you're here before we're ready, he'll run, and a running man is harder to catch than a confident one." Maria stood and squared her shoulders. "Sheriff Prescott." "Simon," he said without looking back at her, "we can dispense with formality. You came in wearing your own wanted poster. I think that earns us first names." She almost smiled. It was small and brief, and she pressed her lips together before it could fully form, but it was there, and Simon, who had his back half-turned to reach for his hat, caught the edge of it in his peripheral vision. He made sure his face gave nothing away. But he carried that almost smile out into the afternoon sunshine with him, tucked somewhere in his chest where it did no harm to anyone. The Henley boarding house was a solid, 2-story affair run by a widow named Beatrice Henley, who had the posture of a woman who had decided long ago that the world was going to have to meet her standards or keep its distance. She was 52, with sharp blue eyes and a gray braid pinned at the back of her head, and when Simon arrived at her door with Maria in tow, she looked Maria up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who wasted no time. "Single room," Simon said. "Miss Underwood will be staying for a week at least. I'll stand good for the cost." "You'll do no such thing," Maria said immediately. "I have a little money," Maria said to Mrs. Henley. "I can pay my own way." Mrs. Henley looked between the two of them with an expression of mild amusement. "Room's $1.50 a week," she said, "and that includes breakfast and supper. You look like you could use both. Come along then." She showed Maria up the narrow staircase to a room at the back of the second floor, small but clean, with a window that looked over the kitchen garden and a bed with a real cotton quilt. After the weeks Maria had spent on the trail, sleeping in the open or in the back corners of crowded way stations, the room looked like something out of a dream she had not let herself have in a long time. She sat on the edge of the bed after Mrs. Henley left and held her hands in her lap and breathed. She had not let herself cry through any of this, not when she left Abilene with nothing but her horse and a change of clothes, not through the cold nights on the prairie or the frightening encounters with strangers who looked at a woman alone with acquisitive eyes, not through the anger and the fear and the grinding weight of being accused of something she had not done. She did not cry now. But she allowed herself, very quietly, to feel the shape of the relief that being believed had carved inside her chest. She slept for 14 hours. She woke to the sound of the kitchen garden sparrows and the smell of cornbread baking, and for a fraction of a moment she did not know where she was, and then she did, and something in her relaxed further. Simon Prescott spent that evening and the following morning moving quietly through Caldwell's small community of business owners and long-term residents, asking careful questions about Douglas Fitch and his associate Morrow. What he found was not surprising but was useful. Benjamin Morrow was a cattle buyer of middling reputation, who was known to cut corners and favor men who operated in the gray edges of legality. Fitch had visited Caldwell twice in the past year, staying at the hotel, meeting with Morrow, and spending time at the Long Branch Saloon. He was described as well-dressed, well-spoken, and charming in the way that certain men were charming, all surface, no depth, and a slight edge of menace if you looked long enough. Simon also sent a wire to the sheriff's office in Abilene. He did not know the man well, but he knew his name and reputation, and what came back within 24 hours was a carefully worded message that told him more by what it avoided saying than by what it said. The Abilene sheriff confirmed that the wanted poster for Maria Underwood was issued at the request of a complaint filed by Douglas Fitch and countersigned by a local magistrate named Aldous Porter, who, the message implied without stating outright, was known to have certain business friendships that may have influenced his willingness to sign things quickly. Simon folded the wire carefully and put it in his coat pocket. On the second morning after Maria's arrival, he knocked on the door of the Henley boarding house at breakfast time, and Mrs. Henley let him in and pointed up the stairs with a brief, "She's eating," that made him feel, inexplicably, like he was 16 years old again and calling on someone he had no business calling on. He pushed that feeling aside because he was a practical man and went up to find Maria sitting at the small table near the window of the common room on the upper landing, working through a plate of scrambled eggs and cornbread with the focused efficiency of a person who had been hungry for a long time and was not taking a good meal for granted. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and something in her expression opened slightly, the careful guard dropping just enough to show that his presence was not unwelcome. It was a small thing. Simon noticed it the way he noticed most things, quietly, without reaction, filing it away in that part of his mind that was always paying attention. "There's coffee," she said, gesturing at the pot on the small table. "Mrs. Henley leaves it." He poured himself a cup and sat in the other chair across from her, and he told her what he had found. He told her about Morrow, about the message from Abilene, about the magistrate's name. He laid it all out plainly and without softening it, because she was not a woman who needed things softened, she needed them true. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the yard below where a rooster was conducting some urgent business near the fence posts. "So even if we find evidence," she said slowly, "the magistrate who issued the warrant may not be the kind of man who reverses things easily." "Not him personally," Simon agreed. "But a circuit judge comes through Caldwell in 6 weeks, and a circuit judge outranks a town magistrate considerably. If we have evidence before Fitch arrives, evidence of his pattern, of what he did to your cousin, of his methods, we can make a proper case." He paused. "Your cousin Clara, could she testify?" Maria's jaw tightened. "Clara has her shop to protect. If she testifies against Fitch and he's not fully stopped, he could—" "I know," Simon said. "I'm not asking you to put her in danger. I'm asking whether, if the time is right and the case is solid, she would be willing." Maria turned back from the window and met his eyes. Something passed between them in that look, not a decision exactly, but the recognition of a shared seriousness, a mutual willingness to see this through properly rather than halfway. "Yes," she said. "If the case is solid, Clara would stand up. She's braver than she lets on." "All right then," Simon said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a habit she was already beginning to recognize. "Fitch is expected within the next few days." Morrow sent a message to him through the telegram office. "I have a friend who works the line, and he told me Fitch's reply arrived yesterday. He's coming to sign some kind of business arrangement with Morrow about land purchases along the cattle route." Maria set her fork down. "Land purchases?" "Yes, that's what he does," she said, and her voice had gone very flat and precise. He identifies properties along routes, cattle routes, trade routes, properties that small business owners have spent years building, and he buys them out by any means necessary. Intimidation, false accusations. He creates trouble for the owners and then sweeps in when they're desperate. She paused. He's not just a man with a grudge against me. He is operating a system. Simon looked at her with those steady gray eyes. Then we dismantle the system, he said very simply. She looked at him for a moment, and this time the almost smile she'd had the previous day made it slightly further. It was not quite a full smile yet, but it was close enough to warm his chest considerably. "You are a strange kind of sheriff," she said. "So I've been told," Simon replied, and he stood up, put his hat on, and went back to work. The town of Caldwell had a rhythm to it in those summer days, the mornings smelling of horse and fresh bread, the afternoons thick with dust and heat, and the sound of cattle distant on the plain, the evenings cooling slowly while the saloon filled up and the families of the town drew their curtains, and the night belonged to the trail hands and the gamblers. Maria moved through it carefully, learning its patterns, letting herself be seen enough to become unremarkable, and not so much that she drew attention to herself. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she liked Caldwell. It was rough and unfinished at its edges, but there was a realness to it, a lack of pretension, that she found she preferred to the aspirations of Abilene, which had been trying so hard to be a proper city that it had forgotten how to be itself. Here, people worked hard and said direct things, and there was a kind of honesty in the difficulty of the place that Maria, who had spent 2 years navigating lies, found unexpectedly refreshing. She also found, to her less mild surprise, that she kept finding reasons to be near Simon Prescott. It was not intentional. That is, it began not being intentional. He came to check on her each morning, which was professional and reasonable. He kept her informed of what he found in his investigation, which was collaborative and necessary. They fell into the habit of sitting together in the evenings on the front porch of the Henley boarding house when the heat broke, drinking the weak lemonade Mrs. Henley pressed from whatever citrus the supply wagon brought through, talking about what they'd observed during the day. Simon talked about Caldwell with the particular affection of a man who had chosen a place deliberately, and was still convinced, most days, that he'd chosen right. He talked about the cattle drives and the way they changed the town's temperament during the season, about the families that were trying to build something permanent out of the dust and uncertainty, about the specific satisfactions of small justice, the recovered stolen horse, the peacefully resolved dispute, the drunken cowboy talked down from a fight before anything broke. He was not a man who needed grand gestures. He found meaning in the specific and the small. Maria listened with the attentiveness of someone who was hearing a language she had almost forgotten and was remembering it again. She had been in survival mode for so long that she had forgotten what it sounded like when a person talked about their life with contentment rather than with the constant underlying calculation of threat and defense. She talked, too, more than she had expected to. She talked about Missouri, about her mother who had taught her to sew and to ride horses and to read from a leather-bound collection of poems, about the specific grief of losing her and the way it had displaced her entirely, leaving her in the world without an anchor. She talked about Clara and how the dressmaking shop had been a gift, a place to be, a thing to build toward, a reason to get up in the mornings. She talked about what it felt like to have that taken from her, to be made into a criminal by the word of a man who had never once considered that she was a full and complete human being rather than an obstacle to be removed. She did not say all of this at once. It came out in pieces, evening by evening, the way trust is always actually built, not in grand declarations, but in the accumulation of small, honest moments, each one a little braver than the last. On the fourth evening, the sky over the Kansas plain turned colors that defied description, a layering of gold and rose and deep violet that Maria had never seen anywhere else, the kind of sunset that makes you feel for a moment that the world is trying to show off. She and Simon sat on the porch steps and watched it without talking, and the silence between them was the easy kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. "Do you miss Missouri?" Simon asked at last. "Sometimes," Maria said. "I miss the green of it. Kansas is beautiful, but it's a different kind of beautiful. It's all sky and distance. Missouri was trees and rivers, smaller and closer." "I grew up in Ohio," Simon said. "Not so different from Missouri, I expect. I came west when I was 22 and never entirely went back." "What brought you here, to law work?" Simon considered. "I was in the cavalry for 2 years," he said. "Came out of it knowing a few things, knowing how to handle a weapon, knowing how to read people under pressure, knowing that I didn't want to spend my life in an institution being told what to think. The law at the local level out here, it's different from an institution. It's just you and the place you're responsible for and the people who live in it. I like the accountability of that." Maria turned to look at him in the evening light. He was in profile, looking out at the plain, the fading colors picking out the angles of his face, and she had the sudden, clear, slightly unnerving thought that this was an exceptionally good man sitting next to her. Not perfect, she could see the complexity and the weight he carried, the ways in which 9 years of law work had put lines in his face that were not all from squinting at the sun, but genuinely good in the deep and considered way that goodness is when it has been chosen rather than simply inherited. She looked away before he turned back to her. "What will you do," he asked, "when this is over?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been so focused on getting to the other side of it that I haven't thought much about what the other side looks like. You could go back to Abilene, back to the shop." "Maybe," she said, "or maybe something new entirely. I've been thinking that with a clear name and with whatever I've learned on this particular adventure," she said the word with a slight, self-deprecating irony, "I might try to establish something of my own. I have skills. I'm a good seamstress, I'm a reasonable cook, and I know how to run a ledger." Simon turned to look at her then, and there was something in his expression that was warmer than professional interest, something he had been keeping carefully managed for several days now, and that was becoming increasingly difficult to keep managed. "Caldwell could use a good seamstress," he said. His voice was perfectly level. Maria looked at him. A beat of silence passed. "Is that an official position you're advertising?" she said carefully. "No," he said, "just an observation." Another beat. Then a purely professional observation. He met her eyes and held them, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and in that moment something that had been quietly building between them like weather building on the horizon, present and inevitable but not yet arrived, came a single step closer. "Not entirely," he admitted. Maria looked at him for a long second and then looked back at the darkening plain. "Let's get through this first," she said softly. "Agreed," he said, and if there was a slight roughness to the word, a slight heaviness to it, he managed it with the same steadiness he managed everything. They sat on the porch for another hour while the stars came out one by one over Kansas, and the sounds of the saloon drifted from 2 streets over, and neither of them moved to go inside until Mrs. Henley opened the door and told them the night air was getting cool, and she was making hot tea for anyone with the sense to come in for it. Douglas Fitch arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday, riding in on a bay gelding that was better kept than most, wearing a brown coat and a good hat, and that particular brand of easy confidence that belonged to men who had never faced a consequence they couldn't purchase their way out of. He was 44 years old, wide through the chest, with a handsome but hard face and pale eyes that moved quickly across his surroundings in a way that was not quite the same as alertness. It was more like calculation, the constant assessment of advantage. Maria watched him arrive from the second-floor window of the Henley boarding house. She recognized him immediately. She had only seen him 3 times in Abilene, but his face had been so clear in her mind all these months, sharpened by anger and injustice, that she would have recognized him on a moonless night from 50 yards. Her hands tightened on the window frame. Simon had told her to wait, to let him handle the initial approach, and she had agreed. She held to that agreement now through sheer force of will. Simon was already in position. He had spent the previous 2 days learning Fitch's likely pattern, the hotel first, then Morrow's office near the cattle yards, then an evening at the Long Branch. He waited until Fitch had checked into the hotel and settled himself before making his first move, which was not a confrontation but an introduction. He walked into the hotel and greeted Fitch at the front desk with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who ran the town and wanted to welcome a newcomer, nothing more. Fitch shook his hand and smiled the kind of smile that was all performance. "Sheriff, fine town you have here." "It suits," Simon said. "You're here on business with Morrow, I understand." "That's right. A few land arrangements to finalize." Fitch's pale eyes assessed Simon with the quick efficiency of a man who categorized people rapidly. He seemed to categorize Simon as useful and unthreatening, which was exactly what Simon intended. "Well, if there's anything you need during your stay, my office is on the main street," Simon said, and left it there. That evening, Simon sat down with the evidence he had been gathering. It was not as complete as he would have liked, he needed more time, but Fitch's arrival changed the clock. He had gone through land records at the county seat by telegraph correspondence, and what emerged was a pattern. 3 towns in the past 4 years. Hargrove's Dry Goods in Abilene was only the most recent. In Dodge City, 2 years prior, a feed store owner named Caldwell, no relation to the town, had been accused of watering his goods by a complaint filed through Fitch, lost his business to a forced sale at a low price, and the property had been transferred to a holding company that turned out to be connected to Fitch through 2 layers of paperwork. In Newton, before that, a hotel owner had faced sudden accusations of operating an unlicensed gambling establishment, accusations that disappeared after the hotel was sold. It was a system. Maria had been right. It was a deliberate, practiced system of destruction and acquisition, and Douglas Fitch had been running it for years. Simon spread the documents across his desk and looked at them, and felt the particular cold anger that he allowed himself when he looked at evidence of calculated cruelty, a controlled anger, the kind that made him think more clearly rather than less. He went to find Maria. She was in the common room of the boarding house, sitting in the lamplight, working with a needle and thread on a tier in the hem of her coat, the same practiced, efficient movements she had grown up with, the skill her mother had given her. She looked up when he came through the door and Mrs. Henley had let him in. There was something in her face when she saw him, a quick, involuntary thing, a lightening, that she did not quite manage to contain before she smoothed it back to composed. Simon sat across from her and spread the copied notes he had made on the table between them. "He's done this before," he said, "multiple times, and I can prove the pattern." He walked her through it. She listened without interrupting, and as the picture became clear, he watched her expression move through several things: recognition, anger, the particular grief of learning that what happened to you was not random cruelty but practiced cruelty, which is its own specific kind of devastating. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara needs to know. If she's willing to testify to what Fitch did in Abilene, and the feed store owner in Dodge will speak, and the hotel owner in Newton." "I've sent wires," Simon said. "I'm waiting on replies. In the meantime, I want to confront Fitch directly tomorrow. Not in an official capacity yet. I want to see how he behaves when he's confronted. Men like him, when they feel cornered, they reveal themselves. They either run or they escalate, and either one gives me something to work with." "I want to be there," Maria said immediately. Simon looked at her. He had expected this. He had been thinking about how to respond to it. "I know you do," he said, "and I understand why. But if Fitch sees you before we've had the confrontation, he will know immediately that we're working together, and he will adjust his behavior accordingly. He needs to not see you coming." Maria pressed her lips together. "After," she said. "I want to see him face me after. I want him to see me." "After," Simon agreed. "I promise you that." She looked at him steadily, evaluating the promise, deciding to trust it. She nodded once. The next morning, Simon walked into the Long Branch Saloon at 10 o'clock in the morning when it was mostly empty and Douglas Fitch was nursing a coffee at the bar before his meeting with Morrow, and he sat down on the stool beside him and said, in a perfectly conversational tone, "I've been going through some land records. Interesting reading." Fitch turned to look at him, and the pleasant professional mask he wore did not slip, but something behind his pale eyes sharpened. "Oh, how so?" "Well," Simon said, picking up his own coffee and looking at it with mild interest, "there are some curious patterns in property transfers along this part of the cattle route over the past several years. Properties changing hands at unusually low prices following unusual legal troubles for the original owners. Troubles that seem to have a common point of origin." Fitch was quiet for exactly 2 seconds too long. "I'm not sure what that has to do with me," he said. "Probably nothing," Simon said pleasantly. "I'm just naturally curious. It's the professional hazard of law work you start to notice patterns." He turned to look at Fitch directly then, and his gray eyes were entirely steady. "You know, a woman came through here a few days ago. Fascinating person. She had a wanted poster pinned to the front of her coat." Fitch went very still. "Her name was on it," Simon continued in exactly the same mild conversational tone. "Maria Underwood. The poster said she burned down a dry goods store in Abilene. That ring any bells?" "I filed that complaint," Fitch said, and his voice was even but had lost some of its warmth. "I witnessed what I witnessed." "Sure," Simon said. "Only thing is, I've been talking to some people, and I've found a few of those people who describe a pattern that looks a lot like what Miss Underwood described to me when she sat down in my office." He paused. "You're meeting with Morrow today about land purchases, aren't you? Along the cattle route." He let a silence develop. "I'll tell you what, Mr. Fitch. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if those particular arrangements didn't finalize, and if we could figure out some way to clear Miss Underwood's name of a charge that appears to be without foundation." Fitch stood up from his stool with a movement that was controlled, but carried the coiled energy of a man who was recalculating everything. "I think you're overstepping, Sheriff," he said. His voice had hardened at the edges. "It's possible," Simon said agreeably. "I've been known to do that. But I have a circuit judge coming through in under 6 weeks, and I have a considerable amount of documentation that I am prepared to present to him. So perhaps we can have another conversation tomorrow and see if there's any ground for agreement." He picked up his hat and stood. "Enjoy your coffee." He walked out of the saloon into the morning sunshine and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, letting the tension in his chest release slowly through a long breath. That had been the opening move. He did not know yet what Fitch would do, but he had placed the pieces, and now he had to watch how they moved. What Fitch did was what cornered men who have been operating successfully for years almost always do when they first encounter real resistance. He attempted to go around it. That afternoon, a man came to the sheriff's office. He was a deputy from a neighboring county, young and nervous-looking, and he delivered a formal request from the Abilene magistrate for Simon to enforce the existing warrant for Maria Underwood's arrest. Simon read the request carefully, folded it, and set it on his desk. Then he said to the young deputy, in a perfectly polite voice, "You can tell Magistrate Porter that I've received his communication, and I am reviewing it. I expect to have a full response within the week." After the deputy left, Simon sat at his desk for a while, thinking. He wrote 2 more telegraph messages, one to the Kansas Attorney General's office in Topeka, detailing the pattern of complaints and property transfers, and asking for a legal opinion on whether a circuit judge could suspend an existing warrant pending investigation. The other was to a judge he knew personally in Wichita, a man of sound character who had no connection to Fitch or Porter, asking for an informal consultation. Then he went to find Maria, because she needed to know about the warrant request, and she deserved to hear it from him and not from someone else. She was in the kitchen garden behind the boarding house when he found her, helping Mrs. Henley tie up some unruly bean vines with strips of cloth. She had taken off her hat, and her dark hair was partly unpinned, falling loose around her shoulders in the afternoon heat, and she was talking to Mrs. Henley with a lightness in her voice that he had not heard before. A laugh, genuine and unguarded, at something the older woman had said about the obstinate nature of bean plants. She heard his boots on the gravel path and turned, and the laugh faded when she read his expression. She handed the cloth strips back to Mrs. Henley and walked toward him without being asked. He told her about the warrant request plainly and without drama, and her face went through several things quickly before settling into the focused calm that he had come to understand was her battle posture, the thing she put on when things got harder so she could keep moving through them. "They're coordinating," she said. "Fitch reached out to Porter the moment he walked out of the saloon. That's what I think, yes. Which means he's more concerned than he let on when you spoke to him." "Yes," Simon said. "Concerned men make mistakes, and I have contacted the Attorney General's office and a judge I trust. This is not over." Maria looked at him for a long moment. They were standing close together in the narrow garden path, closer than was strictly necessary given the available space, and neither of them stepped back. The afternoon heat pressed around them. "Simon," she said, and his name in her mouth had a quality to it that was different from the way she said other words, slower, more deliberate, like she was acknowledging something. "Yes," he said. "If this doesn't work, if Fitch manages to, it will work," he said, with a quiet certainty that was not bravado. It was the certainty of a man who had decided he was not going to let it be otherwise and meant it. She looked at him, and the careful guard she kept came down another degree. "How are you so steady?" she asked, not with frustration but with genuine curiosity, the kind that comes when one person finds in another something they did not know they were looking for. Simon thought about it. "I've had a lot of practice," he said, "and I find it easier to stay steady when the thing I'm trying to protect is worth protecting." The silence that followed was the particular kind that follows when a person says something that means more than its words and both people know it. Mrs. Henley's voice came from the other end of the garden. "I don't know what you two are discussing down there, but supper's going to be in an hour, and I'd appreciate some help shelling these peas." Maria stepped back from Simon and turned toward Mrs. Henley with something that was unmistakably a smile. A real one, full and warm, the kind that changed her whole face and made her look entirely different from the exhausted, guarded woman who had ridden into Caldwell 3 days ago with a wanted poster on her chest. Simon looked at that smile and stood in the garden path for a moment after she walked away, and acknowledged to himself, quietly and with a kind of resigned gladness, that he was in considerable trouble. The replies to his telegraph messages arrived over the next 2 days, and they were better than he had hoped. The Attorney General's office sent a formal letter indicating that an existing warrant could be suspended pending formal investigation, when supported by documented evidence of possible misconduct in the original complaint. The judge in Wichita, a man named Harlan Burke who had the reputation of a careful and honest jurist, sent a personal note saying he was aware of Douglas Fitch's name through a case he had heard in Wichita 2 years prior, that the pattern Simon described aligned with that earlier case, and that he would be arriving in Caldwell in 10 days to conduct a preliminary hearing rather than waiting for the regular circuit schedule. 10 days. Simon held the note and felt the clock shift in their favor for the first time. He took the notes to Maria. She read them at the table in the boarding house common room, and he watched the moment she understood, the way the tension in her shoulders changed, very subtly, the way her breathing shifted. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he confirmed. She set the notes down on the table and looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly, but was in the same neighborhood as them. The brightness of something that has been under enormous pressure for a long time, finding the first real crack of light. "We need Clara," she said. "I need to write to her. I'll have the letter sent through the telegraph office. The operator can send a wire with the key points. It'll be faster than post." "Yes," Maria said. She stood up and then seemed to remember herself and sat back down. "Simon, thank you. I need you to know," she paused, searching for words with a precision that was characteristic of her. I came to Caldwell expecting to fight this entirely alone. I have been fighting everything alone for 2 years. I know how to do it, but I would be lying if I said I had expected anyone to simply decide to help without. She stopped. She looked at the table. Simon sat down across from her. Without wanting anything in return, he completed quietly. Yes, she said, without wanting anything in return. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, I do want something, Maria. I want you to be clear of this and safe, and he paused. He was a man who chose his words deliberately, and this was a word he had been turning over for several days, examining it from different angles, testing it against his own honesty. And I want you to stay. Not because I think you have any obligation to, but because these 10 days have made me considerably less interested in a future where you ride back out of Caldwell the same way you rode in. The lamp on the table was low and warm. Outside, the Kansas evening was settling in its usual way, the distant cattle sounds fading, the stars beginning their appearance. Maria looked at Simon Prescott across the table and felt something in her chest that was terrifying and necessary and entirely real. Let's get through this first, she said, very softly. The same words she'd said on the porch, but this time they carried a different weight, not a deflection, but a promise. Simon nodded, and his eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away, and there was no managing required. He was just glad, simply and completely, and he let himself be. Clara Underwood arrived in Caldwell 7 days later. She came on the morning train from Abilene, a small, rounded woman of 32 with Maria's dark coloring, and a face that was gentle until it wasn't. And when Maria met her at the station platform, and they held each other for a moment. The first real moment of physical comfort Maria had had in months. Maria felt the last of the brittle shell she had built around herself during her time on the run developed several significant cracks. You look terrible, Clara said, pulling back to look at her. Thank you, Maria said. But better than I feared, Clara added more seriously. Your letters said you were all right, but letters lie. I am all right, Maria said. More than all right. Clara, I want you to meet someone. She turned and Simon was there, having given them a moment before approaching, and Maria said, This is Sheriff Simon Prescott. He is the reason we have a hearing in 3 days. Clara looked at Simon with the sharp, comprehensive look of a woman who has spent her life reading customers quickly, and then she looked at Maria, and then back at Simon, and something in her expression became privately and thoroughly satisfied. Sheriff, she said warmly, shaking his hand. Maria has written about you. She's mentioned you as well, Simon said. The courage it took to hold on to your shop all this time, that matters enormously to what we're building for this case. Clara's face went serious. I want to testify. I have records. I kept everything. Every threat, every conversation, every attempt Fitch made to pressure me. I wrote it down at the time because something told me to. She paused. I am very angry about what was done to my cousin, and I would very much like a judge to hear about it. Simon smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not the carefully managed softening he usually allowed himself, but a full one, which changed his face substantially and made him look younger and considerably more approachable. Maria, standing beside him, noticed. She noticed in the way you notice something that you've been not quite letting yourself look at directly, and now you have, and you cannot look away again. The hearing before Judge Harlan Burke took place on a Thursday morning in the Caldwell courthouse, which was a dignified word for a large room at the back of the town hall that had been fitted with a proper bench and chairs for exactly this kind of purpose. The room was modest, but it felt significant, the way that justice rooms do when something real is being decided in them. Simon had prepared the case with careful thoroughness. He presented the land records, the pattern of complaints and transfers across 3 towns, the correspondence from the Wichita case that Judge Burke himself recognized, and his own investigation into the originating complaint against Maria in Abilene. He had also, through further inquiries, located the man in Dodge City whose feed store had been taken, a man named Rufus Caldwell who had written a signed affidavit describing his experience, which arrived by post 2 days before the hearing and was admitted as evidence. Clara testified for 40 minutes. She was precise and composed and devastating in the clarity of her account, reading from the journal she had kept with the focused certainty of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and intended to make every word count. She described Fitch's visits, his veiled and not-so-veiled threats, his specific statement that things have a way of going badly for people who don't know when to make a sensible business decision, his presence at the county building the week before the fire, and the suddenness with which Maria's name appeared in connection with the fire when she had been nowhere near Hargrove's store that night. Judge Burke listened to all of it with the patience and intelligence of a man who has spent his life separating the true from the false. He asked careful questions. He reviewed documents. Douglas Fitch, who had retained the company of a lawyer from Wichita who had arrived the previous day with impeccable timing, presented his countercase. The lawyer was smooth and capable and made several good arguments. But the pattern was too clear, and Judge Burke was too experienced, and the facts had the particular solidity of things that are true. Maria testified last. She stood before the bench in a dress she had pressed that morning with the iron Mrs. Henley kept by the stove, her hair pinned neatly, her hands folded, and she told the truth with the same directness she had walked into Simon's office with 10 days ago, clear-eyed and precise, and completely without self-pity, which was perhaps the most compelling thing about her account. When she finished, Judge Burke was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Underwood, the evidence before this court does not support the complaint that led to the warrant for your arrest. That warrant is hereby suspended pending formal review by the county court, to which I will submit this record. In my professional opinion, the complaint was filed without adequate foundation and with apparent ulterior motive." He turned his gaze to the table where Douglas Fitch sat with his lawyer. "As for the broader pattern of activities described in this proceeding, I am forwarding this record to the Kansas Attorney General's office with a recommendation for further investigation. Mr. Fitch, I would strongly advise against conducting any further business in the state of Kansas until that investigation has concluded." He looked down at his papers and then back at the room. "This hearing is concluded." The room let out its breath. Maria stood very still for one moment, and then Clara was beside her, and the two women held each other in the middle of the Caldwell courtroom while the room around them buzzed with the movement and chatter of people dispersing, and Maria let herself, finally, feel the full weight of what had just been lifted. Simon stood to the side and watched, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done right, justice achieved the slow way, the thorough way, the only way that actually holds. Douglas Fitch left Caldwell on his horse before the day was out. His business arrangement with Morrow dissolved when Morrow, who was a practical man above all else, decided that the very visible attention of a circuit judge was not the kind of company he wanted to keep. Fitch did not look back as he rode out, which was the behavior of a man who knew the ground had shifted under him entirely. The Attorney General's investigation that followed would take months, but it would end with Douglas Fitch facing a criminal court on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud, the kind of reckoning that, once it came, would be thorough and final. That evening, the Caldwell town felt lighter to Maria. She sat on the boarding house porch with Clara on one side of her and a glass of Mrs. Henley's lemonade in her hand, and the sun went down over Kansas with its usual extravagant beauty, and Maria breathed in the evening air and felt, for the first time in 2 years, simply free. Simon came by at dusk, as she had found herself expecting him to. He greeted Clara with a nod and a word, and Clara, who had, over the course of 3 days, assembled a very comprehensive picture of the situation between her cousin and this particular sheriff, excused herself with masterful subtlety, and went inside to help Mrs. Henley with the supper dishes. Simon sat on the porch step beside Maria and they were quiet together for a while. "You did that," she said at last. "What happened today? That was yours." "That was yours," he said. "You're the one who rode into town wearing the poster and sat down in my office and told the truth. The rest was just making sure the truth had somewhere proper to be heard." She turned to look at him. The evening was soft around them, warm and golden, and Simon Prescott in this light was not the composed professional of the office or the careful strategist of the past 10 days. He was just a man sitting on a porch step with the last of the sunset in his gray eyes, looking at her with something that had stopped being manageable some time ago and had simply become his face when he looked at her. "I told you I hadn't thought about what the other side of this looked like," she said. "You did," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. He waited in his patient way without pushing. "Clara is going back to Abilene tomorrow," Maria said. "The shop needs her. She's already worried about the days she's been away." "Of course," Simon said. "She asked me to come back with her," Maria said, "back to needle and thread. She made it very clear that I am welcome and that there's work for me in a room above the shop." "That sounds like a good offer," Simon said, and his voice was even, though something in it was very quiet. "It is," Maria said. She looked down at her hands. "It's a very good offer. Clara is my family and I love her and the shop matters to me." She paused. "But when I try to picture myself back in Abilene, what I see is not complete. Something is missing from the picture." The silence between them was very full. "Maria," Simon said. "Yes," she said. "I am going to say something that I would rather not have misunderstood," he said, with the deliberate care of a man who takes words seriously. "So I'm going to be quite plain about it." "Please," she said softly. He turned to face her fully on the step. "I have spent 10 days watching you be the bravest, most clear-eyed, most genuinely good person I have been in close proximity to in my adult life. And I have been telling myself to wait to see what you wanted, to not put weight on something that was already carrying enough. But you have a train to consider and I think I need to say something before you consider it." He paused. "I don't want you to go. Not because Caldwell needs a seamstress, though it does, but because I have found in a very short and very specific number of days that you have become the most important part of my morning and my evening and most of the hours in between. And that is not something I take lightly." Maria looked at him, and her expression was open in a way she had rarely let herself be open, without the guard, without the careful composure, just her own face in the evening light, showing everything. "Simon," she said, "I rode 200 miles across Kansas to fight for my own name. I am not afraid of a thing that is worth fighting for." He looked at her. "I would like to stay," she said, very simply. "If you are asking me to." "I am asking you to," he said, and the steadiness of his voice carried something deep and sincere and permanent. Clara, who had not gone to help with the dishes at all but had rather positioned herself just inside the slightly open front window of the boarding house parlor, turned away from the window at that point with a small, entirely private smile, and went to find Mrs. Henley and help with the dishes after all. What happened over the following months was not sudden or dramatic, but it had the quality of the best things. It was real, and it grew, and it did not require managing. Maria stayed in Caldwell. She took a room at the Henley boarding house through the summer, and in the fall she rented a small space above the general store and set up a dressmaking work area, and within 4 months she had more customers than she had hours. Caldwell had indeed needed a seamstress, and it turned out that it had needed one who could not only sew but who could also run a proper ledger and was not afraid to negotiate terms. She and Simon moved through the town like two halves of something that had found each other, not in a way that was exclusive of the rest of the world, but in a way that was visible and certain. They walked together in the evenings. He came for breakfast at the boarding house. She brought him supper at the office on the nights when he was working late and forgot to eat, which was more often than it should have been. They argued sometimes about the right way to handle a particular situation, about the pace of things, about whether the new city ordinance about cattle on the main street was going to work or not. And they argued well, which is to say honestly and without cruelty, and always reached the other side of the argument still standing together. He kissed her for the first time on a November evening, when the first cold had come down from the north, and they were standing outside the general store after walking back from a town, meeting about the construction of a new schoolhouse. It had been a long meeting, and she had made 3 very good points in it, and he had been watching her do so with considerable admiration. And then they were outside in the cold, and she had her hands tucked in her coat sleeves, and was saying something about the schoolhouse location, and he kissed her, simply, in the middle of the sentence, and the sentence did not get finished. When they separated, she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I was making an important point." "I know," he said. "The schoolhouse should absolutely be on the east side. You're completely right." She looked at him for another second, and then she laughed, that full, genuine laugh he had first heard in Mrs. Henley's kitchen garden, and he thought, with perfect clarity, that he was going to spend the rest of his life finding reasons to make her laugh. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in March of 1879, on the porch of the small house he had moved to from his rooms above the office. A proper house, the kind a town settled enough to want its sheriff to have. He had not planned it for that particular Sunday. They were sitting in the first good warmth of approaching spring, the Kansas plains stretching around them under a pale blue sky, copper tethered in the small yard where the mare had taken to being kept, and Maria was reading a letter from Clara about the shop and how the spring trade had been strong, and she looked up to say something about it and found Simon watching her. "I love you," he said, which was not quite the proposal yet, but was the foundation of it. She folded the letter in her lap. "I know," she said softly, "I love you too." And she meant it the way that words mean things when they have been lived for a long time before they are said. "Then marry me," he said. "Not because it would be practical, though I think it would be. Not because the town would approve, though most of them would. But because I want to build something with you that is ours, and I cannot think of a thing in my life that I have wanted more deliberately or more completely." Maria looked at him in the spring sunshine, this steady, good, gray-eyed man who had told her to sit down and let him help, and had meant every word of it, who had believed her without demanding proof, who had fought for her with the quiet, thorough power of someone who simply decided that something was right and then did it. "Yes," she said, with the full simplicity of a word that means exactly what it says. They were married in June in the small church on the east side of Caldwell, the side where the schoolhouse was eventually built, vindicating Maria's point permanently. Clara came from Abilene for the wedding and wept openly and without any embarrassment about it. Mrs. Henley made the wedding cake, which was 3 layers and extremely good. The town of Caldwell came out in numbers that surprised Simon and did not entirely surprise Maria, because she had been learning the character of this place and knew that it was, underneath its rough exterior, the kind of community that turned out for things that mattered. Maria wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers along the collar and cuffs, the most beautiful thing she had ever sewn, with hours of precise work in every seam. She had her mother's brooch at the collar. She walked into the church on Clara's arm, because her mother was gone and Clara was her family and it was right, and she walked out on Simon's arm and felt the full, clear weight of belonging somewhere and to someone who was also, without doubt, hers. Life in Caldwell after the wedding had the full and particular texture of a life properly lived. Simon continued as sheriff, which was not always easy and not always safe, but was his, and he did it well. Maria expanded the dressmaking shop into a proper storefront, taking on an apprentice in the 2nd year. A 17-year-old girl named Alice, who was the daughter of one of the cattle hands and had ambitions that went beyond what her current circumstances suggested, and who turned out to be extraordinarily talented with a needle and a natural head for the business end of things. Watching Alice grow into her skills and her confidence was, Maria discovered, one of the unexpected deep pleasures of the life she was building. The letter from the Kansas Attorney General's office arrived 14 months after the Caldwell hearing. Douglas Fitch had been found guilty on 3 counts of fraud in a Kansas City court. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and a substantial fine, the proceeds of which were directed in part to the property owners he had defrauded. The Newton Hotel owner received compensation. The feed store owner in Dodge received compensation. Clara did not receive direct financial recovery since she had not sold the shop, but the formal acknowledgement of what had been done, and the conviction of the man who had done it was its own form of restitution. Maria read the letter at the kitchen table of the house she and Simon shared, and when she finished she set it down very carefully and sat with it for a moment. Simon came in from the yard where he'd been tending to Copper. Maria's horse had become, in the comfortable way of animals in happy households, thoroughly at home, and took one look at her face and knew. He came and sat across from her without asking, waiting. "It's done," she said. He was convicted. "It's done." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over to hold his, and they sat that way in the morning light of their kitchen for a long time, not saying anything that needed saying because the silence itself said it, that what had started with a woman riding into a valley, wearing her own wanted poster pinned to her chest had become this kitchen, this hand in hand, this life that was theirs. The schoolhouse on the east side of town opened in the spring of 1880, and Maria volunteered there 2 mornings a week, teaching the older children reading and basic mathematics, which had turned out to be a skill she had always had and had never had enough occasion to use. She liked the children, their directness, their curiosity, the way they saw the world with the fresh urgency of people who have not yet learned to discount things. Simon watched her with the schoolchildren sometimes, when he walked past on his morning rounds, and the thing he felt in his chest was not possible to fully describe. It was the feeling of rightness, of a world properly ordered, of a thing being what it should be. It was in the late summer of 1880 that they discovered they were expecting a child. Maria told him on a Tuesday evening over supper, with the directness that was fundamental to her nature. No preamble, no performance, just the clear fact of it, watching his face as it processed what she'd said. Simon Prescott, who was known throughout Caldwell as a steady and composed man who could walk into nearly any situation without his expression giving him away, looked at his wife and went through several very visible emotions in quick succession in a way that he was entirely unable to prevent. He stood up from the table, crossed to where she sat, and crouched beside her chair and held her face in his hands very gently. "Maria," he said, and the way he said her name was the way she had been hearing it for 2 years now, as though it were the specific word that meant everything important. "Are you well?" she asked. Yes," he said. "I'm very well, I'm entirely, yes." He was not, evidently, going to be more articulate than that in this particular moment, and she loved him for it, for the way his composure broke apart neatly, and showed her the man underneath who was not composed at all, but was joyful and overwhelmed and entirely hers. Their son arrived in March of 1881, in the middle of a warm spell that had come early to the Kansas plain, the kind of weather that makes everything feel possible. He was a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, which combination produced something startlingly beautiful, and he cried with the impressive conviction of someone who had arrived in the world with a great deal to say and intended to say it. They named him Thomas Henry Prescott, Thomas for Simon's late father, Henry for no particular person, but because it fit, and from the moment he was placed in Maria's arms in the room above the kitchen of their house, with the evening light coming through the curtains and Simon sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on Maria's shoulder, and his gray eyes fixed on this new person they had made together, the world reorganized itself around this new center of gravity. Mrs. Henley came the following morning with a pot of stew, and the air of a woman who had decided that grandmotherly prerogatives extended to those who were not technically her grandchildren. Clara sent a wire and then a letter, and then a package containing a small knitted blanket in blue wool and the most beautiful miniature garments Maria had ever seen. The finest work Clara had ever done, which was saying something. Alice, the apprentice, came to see the baby with wide eyes and the reverent manner of someone encountering something miraculous, and promptly offered to do any sewing needed at the shop so Maria could rest, which was practical and kind and entirely characteristic of who Alice had become. The town of Caldwell, which had been following the story of its sheriff, and the woman who had ridden in with a wanted poster on her chest from the beginning, received the news of Thomas Henry Prescott with the collective warmth of a community that had found itself invested. Life went on and deepened. Maria's shop became the established center of women's trade in Caldwell. She expanded twice, hired Alice properly as a partner by the time Alice was 20, and had earned it completely, and developed a reputation for quality that drew customers from neighboring towns along the cattle route. The injustice that had originally driven her to Caldwell was fully resolved, and its resolution had left her not diminished by the ordeal, but hardened in the particular way that good metal is hardened stronger, more precise, more confident in her own worth and capability. Simon served as sheriff of Caldwell for many more years, and the town grew around him, the schoolhouse, then a second church, then a proper hotel, then a newspaper office, each a small marker of civilization establishing itself in the old wild country. He was re-elected by comfortable margins each time he stood, because Caldwell knew what it had in him. He aged the way good men age, the lines in his face deepening into something increasingly distinguished, the gray at his temples spreading slowly, his eyes remaining the same steady, clear, paying full attention. On a Sunday in the spring of 1883, Thomas was 2 years old and conducting an enthusiastic investigation of the yard outside their house, while his parents sat on the porch in the afternoon warmth, and Maria was mending a hem, and Simon was reading the Kansas newspaper that arrived 3 days late from Topeka, and the sound of the cattle drive moving through the southern edge of town drifted on the wind. And the sky over Kansas was the particular shade of blue that occurred only in spring and only here, and it was, by any measure, an ordinary afternoon, which is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about a life that has been worth building, that the extraordinary becomes ordinary because it is daily, because it is constant, because it is simply yours. Maria set down her mending and looked at her son attempting to negotiate with a confused chicken near the fence post, with the passionate seriousness of a 2-year-old who believes the chicken has a position on the matter and can be persuaded to change it. She looked at Simon beside her, his reading glasses on the end of his nose, his mouth curved in the slight, private smile that she had spent 4 years learning to read, the one that meant he was entirely content. She thought about the morning she had ridden into this valley with a wanted poster pinned to her chest, certain of only one thing, that she was not going to accept a lie about herself, and she was not going to stop until the truth had somewhere to stand. She had been so prepared to fight. She had not been prepared to be helped. She had not been prepared for a man who would look at her exhaustion and her anger and her refused defeat and say, without hesitation, "Sit down and let me help." "What are you thinking?" Simon asked without looking up from the paper. "That I am very glad I rode into Caldwell," she said. He lowered the paper and looked at her over the reading glasses, and the smile widened, and in his eyes was everything. The office, the morning after she'd slept 14 hours, the kitchen garden with the bean vines, the courtroom, the porch, the letter from the Attorney General, the kitchen and the hands held across the table, and Thomas and the years between that morning and this afternoon. "So am I," he said. Thomas made a decisive proclamation at the chicken, who departed with dignity. Maria picked up her mending. The cattle drive sound faded south. The spring afternoon lay warm over Caldwell, Kansas, over the schoolhouse and the shop and the boarding house where Mrs. Henley was no doubt opinionating at someone about the proper way to grow vegetables, over the sheriff's office where Simon's deputy was managing a slow Sunday with professional competence, over the whole sprawling, imperfect, vital, genuine life that had been built here out of the dust and honesty of the wild country. The wanted poster, the one Maria had pinned to the front of her coat that morning and carried 200 miles across Kansas and set flat on a scarred wooden desk in front of a pair of steady gray eyes, had been kept. Simon had asked to keep it, and she had raised an eyebrow at him, and he had held her gaze, and she had said yes. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk at the office, folded once, between the wires from the Attorney General and the message from Judge Burke. He did not take it out often, but sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, he would, and look at the rough woodcut print and the clear printed name and the lie that had been built around it. And he would think about a woman who had refused to be defeated by it, and had ridden into town with it pinned to her chest instead, and he would feel the same thing he had felt in those first moments. The absolute, complete certainty that this person was worth helping, worth fighting for, and worth spending every year that followed in the company of. 3 years after Thomas, Maria came to him on a morning in late spring with the particular expression that he had learned to read, and told him they were expecting again. This time he was better prepared and did not lose his composure entirely, though he came closer to it than he would have expected. Their daughter arrived in the early winter of 1884. They named her Eliza Clara Prescott, Eliza for Simon's mother, Clara for the woman who had shared a shop and a dream and a courtroom, and who was, by now, firmly a fixture in both women's lives regardless of the 200 miles between them. Eliza came into the world with her mother's dark hair and a set of opinions that she began expressing immediately and did not stop expressing, ever, which Maria found both familiar and deeply satisfying. Clara came for the birth and stayed 3 weeks, during which she and Maria stayed up late talking in the way that they had not done since before everything went wrong, the way of sisters rather than cousins. Clara had not married and showed no particular inclination to, and was not unhappy. She had the shop and the friendships of the Abilene community, and a life she had built with her own hands and found sufficient and good. She and Maria talked about their mother, about the early years, about the dressmaking and the things they had both learned that they had not expected to. They talked about Alice, who was by now practically running the Caldwell shop, and had her own ideas about expanding the patterns they offered. They talked about the injustice that had touched both their lives, about Douglas Fitch in his prison cell, about the particular bitterness of being disbelieved by systems that should have protected them. "But you were believed," Clara said one evening, over the tea that Mrs. Henley had sent over in a basket. "One man believed me," Maria said. "Which makes me think about all the women who came to their crossroads and did not find that one man." "What do they do?" Clara asked. Maria was quiet for a moment. "Some of them keep fighting," she said. "Some of them don't." She paused. "I think about that. I've been thinking about whether there's something." She did not finish the sentence that evening, but the thought was there, forming. What it became, over the following year, was a quiet practice Maria developed, a willingness to be the first person to listen, to be the woman who believed another woman without demanding proof. It was not an organization or a formal thing. It was just Maria Underwood Prescott, seamstress and mother and wife and resident of Caldwell, Kansas, who became known in the community as someone you could come to. Women came to the shop with more than their sewing needs. Young women, confused or frightened or treated badly, found their way to the workroom behind the main shop floor where Maria kept the good tea and the comfortable chairs. Nothing dramatic or sweeping happened. But things were said that needed saying and heard by someone who needed to hear them, and more than once a thing was made better because of it. Simon knew about it the way he knew about most things Maria did, fully and with admiration, without inserting himself, trusting her judgment. He had been doing that since the beginning. In the fall of 1885, Caldwell celebrated its official incorporation as a proper city, which involved a dinner and speeches, and a great deal of noise from the saloon that ran considerably later than usual, and which Simon managed with the patient, experienced hand of a man who had been doing exactly this for years. At the dinner, the mayor, a man named Hartford who ran the bank and had good intentions and mediocre taste in hats, made a speech about the town's growth and the people who had built it, and he mentioned Simon Prescott by name as one of the pillars of Caldwell's character and development. He did not mention Maria Underwood Prescott, because it was 1885 and certain things were still as they were, and the injustice of that was noted by Maria and set aside by her in the practical manner of a woman who had already won so many of the fights she'd entered, and understood that the others would come in their time. Simon mentioned it that night when they were home and the children were asleep. "Hartford forgot to include you," he said, with a flatness that contained considerable feeling. "Hartford is still living in a fairly limited understanding of who builds towns," Maria said, without particular bitterness. "He'll get there eventually. He should already be there." "Yes," she agreed, "but being angry at the speed of progress is less useful than being the progress." She paused. "Eliza will not grow up in the same town that I rode into, Simon. That's something." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had come in wearing her own wanted poster, and had become, in 8 years, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of this place that it was no longer imaginable without her. And he thought that there was no fair way to measure what she had made of her life here, but that it was the most impressive thing he had ever witnessed up close, and that he was grateful, with a depth that did not have a bottom, for the morning she had ridden in and sat down. "I love you," he said, in the simple, direct way he had always said it. "I love you," she said, in the equally simple, equally direct way she had always said it back. Thomas grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and was relentlessly curious about the natural world of the Kansas plain, collecting specimens and asking questions that regularly exceeded the knowledge of every adult he encountered. Eliza grew into a girl who had her mother's bearing and her father's gray eyes, and an absolute refusal to be told that something was not for her, which everyone who met her recognized immediately as something to be reckoned with. The four of them were, in all the specific and particular ways of real families, imperfect and complete. They had the ordinary frictions of a life lived closely together, the disagreements and the difficult seasons, and the fears that came in the night about health and weather, and the unpredictable nature of frontier life. But they had the foundational thing, the thing underneath all the ordinary friction, which was that they were genuinely and fully on each other's side, and that made everything else possible. Clara came each year, sometimes twice, and Caldwell was always ready for her with good weather and strong coffee, and the open affection of a community that had come to know her through Maria's love of her. Alice, by 1886, had taken full partnership of the shop in everything but name, and Maria was formalizing that arrangement with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone you believed in grow all the way into themselves. The wild country beyond Caldwell was changing. The big cattle drives were slowing as the railroads pushed further, and the range was divided by fences, and the old open-range world gave way to something more settled and more complex. The West that Maria had ridden through in 1878 wide, and dangerous and free in the frightening way of things without edges, was becoming something else. Some of that loss was real, and some of it was just change, and Simon, who had watched the frontier shift for years, had made his peace with that distinction. What remained constant was the life inside the house on the east side of Caldwell, the life built from the specific and unlikely starting point of a woman on a chestnut mare and a wanted poster, and the simple human act of one person deciding to help another. On a morning in the spring of 1887, Maria Underwood Prescott stood at the window of the dressmaking shop and watched a young woman ride into Caldwell on a tired horse, with a look on her face that Maria recognized the way you recognize your own reflection, the exhausted vigilance, the forward jaw, the held composure of someone who has been fighting alone for too long. She went to the door and opened it before the woman could pass. "Come in," she said. "There's tea, and I'd like to hear what's brought you here." The woman stopped and looked at her with the suspicious, measuring look of someone who had been disappointed before. "Why?" she said. Maria looked at her steadily. "Because someone did that for me once," she said, "and it changed everything." The woman came inside. The Kansas sun moved across the sky above Caldwell the way it always did, wide and bright, and entirely indifferent to the small, significant dramas of human lives playing out beneath it. But inside the shop, in the good light of the workroom, over a cup of strong tea, one woman told the truth to another who listened completely, and something that had been broken began, slowly and carefully, to find its way toward whole. That was how it had always worked. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the specific, daily, deliberate choice to see a person fully and to offer what help you had. Simon Prescott had done it on a summer morning in 1878. Maria Underwood had walked through the door that opened, and the life that followed had been built on that single, foundational act of one person saying to another, "Sit down and let me help." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.